archive footage and films of Keele University. There's about 75 on there, going right back to the first occasion where Princess Margaret became Chancellor in 1962. So it's a mixture, because in the collection, one of our big holdings is the ITV collection. That's all the Midlands filming of ITV. In the early days that would be ATV, news items, then it would be Central TV, through to the end of the era when film was being used and had to be played as a programme went out, like someone had to play it and cue it in and you'd see the piece of film. Up to the holdings on videotape, which are now obsolescent or obsolete forms of videotape. So we do store all that material as well. And talking about Princess Margaret, we use some of that, our footage. And there was a documentary a couple of years ago called Princess Margaret, Rebel Princess it was called. And there was a nice black and white film of her at Keele. And then while watching, you saw Princess Margaret come to a royal ball and go into the union and be introduced to some students, and I just said, "That's me." And it was when I was introduced to Princess Margaret, which I was one of the founder members of Keele Theatre Company while I was here. And what it was in the summer vacation, we would meet here and rehearse and take shows up to the Edinburgh Fringe. And then it would all be over by the time term started. We came back at the beginning of September. Term started in October. And one year we did a wonderful production, and it was an adaptation of a Bennett story, actually, by Peter Turson. And the day after we finished, we got a wonderful review in the Sunday Times. Someone ought to get hold of this show. In London, Peter Turson's play Zigga-Zagga about Stoke City was just finishing, and the theatre was desperate to find anything else by Peter Turson, and the only thing on the horizon was our show at Edinburgh. And so we got an invitation and we played in the West End for a month before coming back to the start of term in October. And on the basis of that, I was invited to the Royal Ball and met the Princess, was in the Royal Bar, and actually took a bet that I would not ask her to dance because she wasn't dancing. And I took the bet and I asked her, and she said yes. So I have danced with the Princess in that ballroom. And then a few years later, on stage, I played Denry Machin, who famously takes a bet to ask the Countess of Chell for a dance. So it was like deja vu all over again. So there we are. What this is a journey. I'm not going to introduce all the elements because it is self-explanatory. And I hope I've constructed a journey that you can follow. It's presented by my friend Kathy Niblett, a ceramic historian, 20th century ceramic historian, but she was deputy head of ceramics at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery for some years. She's an acquaintance of Paul and has worked with Paul over the years in various locations around the country. She can't be here sadly today, but she knows that we're doing this. And her husband Paul has sent best wishes for this occasion. So we're in the company of Kathy Niblett, who I filmed over a period, several times, over a period of 30 years. So these are extracts from programmes I've made at different times. And each time I made a programme of a particular period in the potteries, I always said, well, what was happening in the pottery industry at the time? So I kept updating that. So what I've done is stitched some of these sequences together to make it like a journey through the century. And then several years ago we had one interview to seal it together. Where do we start at the start of the century? What was the most significant thing at the start of the 20th century? She makes that choice. A lot of what she says, these are her own opinions and own ideas. And some are a little contentious, let's say. So these are Kathy's thoughts, and it's the same for everyone who participates. It's nice that when there's always some authoritative information on every film, someone associated with the film you're watching. So while we're watching a Spode film from over 90 years ago, you are hearing Robert Copeland and of course Copeland's owned Spode. So these are personal reminiscences. But because the interview is archived, because I interviewed him some 30 years ago, his personal reminiscence is of the period of the film. So there's value in archive terms, in terms of the voices you hear and what you see. So this is the journey. I hope you enjoy the trip, and we're going to initiate it now. He says. Just get it. Well, it's not doing what, it's not behaving for me. So.
These are the villages. Under the fields was clay, and under the clay, coal. They mined the coal and dug the clay, and the villages grew. They spread and joined into a single close-packed huddle of factories and houses. The landscapes, lakes and mountains were made by man, and its forests were the bottle-shaped ovens that from coal and clay make pottery.
The firing of ware in potteries is traditionally based upon firing with coal in bottle ovens, and that is why the pottery industry was based in Staffordshire. The coal was exactly right for the job. However, everybody knows that this was a very bad thing for pollution, for the environment and for the workers. And therefore, if anyone could devise a cleaner, more efficient way of firing, they would be onto a winner. And in fact, it was a man called Conrad Dressler who succeeded in devising tunnel ovens. That is a very long tube in which wares would enter at a cool end, go through warming up, very intense heat, and then right through to the other end where they would cool down gradually. The kiln itself would then remain very hot in the centre all the time. This would be a continuous firing process, whereas bottle ovens are an intermittent firing process, and almost all of the fuel used in firing a bottle oven was consumed by heating up the fabric of the bottle oven itself. Got nothing at all to do with firing the product inside the bottle oven. Therefore, when Conrad Dressler was able to install a tunnel oven at Barrett's Tile Works in Stoke in 1910, the industry was actually revolutionised. Pottery factory buildings in the potteries have always followed a very similar format, usually on 2 stories, 1 or 2 on 3 stories. But at the beginning of the 20th century, new ideas were coming along, and in 1913 there were 3 very important coincidences. There was a Health and Safety Act in 1913, and one of the earliest of the female factory inspectors, Florence Lovibond, married William Moorcroft. And in that year, William Moorcroft set up his own business. And so, William and Florence together devised the Moorcroft factory in Sandbach Road, Burton, exactly to conform to the Factory Act, the Health and Safety Act of 1913. And so suddenly we have an extremely modern factory here in the heart of the potteries, likely to be the very first factory built in the 20th century. And the importance of the Moorcroft factory was the fact that it did conform to all the regulations. So, for example, when you look at the building, it looks austere. There are no outside windows, and that is because there is north lights above every workshop. The workers therefore getting absolutely pure daylight to assist in the tube lining and painting, which are the features of Moorcroft's handcrafted work. The floors were slightly domed, they ran off to gullies at the sides, and they were concrete, so that they could be swabbed down, the level of dust would be kept low, and all the mess went away at the edges. The doors were wider than usual, so trucks of wear plus people could easily pass through them. It was built all together on one floor, therefore there was no possible accident of climbing stairs or contamination from dust coming through from the floor above. And I think the very best of all, there were individual private lavatories for the women and the men, separate facilities, both for lavatories and for eating their meals, instead of having the chance of contaminating yourself as you ate your sandwiches at dinner time by the noxious things that might be in the cups that you were using. A tremendous step forward. Of course, 1913, it did coincide with the outbreak of the First World War very soon afterwards. So the Moorcroft factory was built in 3 stages, but nevertheless a very, very important development as far as the potteries area was concerned. The majority of fashionable style seems to have originated on the continent, and the one which bridges the late 19th and early 20th century is L'Art Nouveau, Art Nouveau, the new style. And some pottery manufacturers really knew that this was happening, and it's very encouraging to see that companies like Moorcroft and Robert Dalton had captured this very, very well. But for other people, the classical style was their dominant feature. And we have, especially from Wedgwood, a beautiful cream-coloured earthenware style called Envy. This was commissioned in Paris by the retailers Panier Frère, and this style of classical, well-designed work takes Wedgwood right through to about 1930.
The pottery towns were still dominated by the smoke and haze which was part and parcel of coal firing. But 1930 was a year of particular hardship for the industry, following the Wall Street crash the previous year.
The thing that has to be remembered is that the pottery industry, then as now, was very dependent on the North American market, Canada, the United States, for the bulk of its exports, and anything that had a detrimental effect on the economic circumstances in North America would in turn have an effect on the ceramic industry. Well, to begin with, the slump had an effect on the top end of the market, that is the market for the more expensive tablewares, and progressively the slump affected other areas of the market concerned with the manufacture, let's say, of the cheaper latter part of 1930 that the whole of the ceramic industry was rather severely affected by the Wall Street tunnel.
Hot backyards were a natural storage space for the raw materials, some ball clay being allowed to mature for months before use.
In the 1930s and before that period, many manufacturers were still mixing their own products that they would receive from the miller, ball clay, china clay, flint, cornerstone, and that they would proceed to mix these materials to produce a specific barley, whether it be porcelain, another china in Staffordshire, or earthenware. There is of course, the well-proven theory that if you allow materials to weather, to be exposed to the elements, that this in effect improves their working properties. I think probably it had more to do with the fact that they were receiving regular supplies of these materials.
Canals were still in use actually in the 1930s, as could be seen in this picture, but it was the beginning of a radical change. Electric kiln was the first electric kiln on the Spoke factory was built in 1934 for decorating on-glazed pottery. And in 1936, a gas-fired tunnel kiln was introduced. I don't know that it was the first in the industry, but it was of an advanced design, and this fired the underglazed decorated earthenwares and of course the ordinary glazed earthenwares. It was a long time before our china was fired, other than in bottle ovens, but it was the start. Our tunnel kiln, of course, had to take up a very large length of land, and so it was only really the larger potteries to start with that could afford the space, and also had enough bottle kilns to keep the factory going while several of the other buildings were torn down so that a new tunnel was introduced. And so the switch over to more modern methods of firing was a very long process. So far as the Spoke factory was concerned, it was run up until 1932 as a partnership between Robert Copeland and Gresham Copeland. And then, feeling the need for commercial expertise, they invited Arthur Edward Hewitt, known as Ted Hewitt, to join them. He had run a very successful factory in Longton, and so he brought a new look to the commercial side. And he introduced Frank Thorley, who came from Wedgwood. He'd worked with Wedgwood all his working life, and he brought a sense of quality to the marketing of the Spoke product. In the United States, great expansion was taking place, despite the fact that it was a recession. We were still coming out of the Great Recession of the 1920s. The 1930s were difficult times. And one of the introductions, which I understand was introduced by our own sole agent in New York, Sidney Thompson, was the introduction of what today is commonplace, and that is the place setting. Closed sets, as they were called, a dinner set for 6 persons or 12 persons, complete with vegetable dishes and so forth, was too expensive for most people to buy during those rather difficult years. And so Thompson introduced this idea of a place setting consisting of 3 plates, a teacup and a tea saucer, and people could start building it up. Those are the days that you could almost guarantee that once bought, a pattern of dinnerware or teaware was replaceable for years to come. Nowadays, with the introduction of more modern long runs of production, that just is not possible. But in those days, in the 30s, factories were perfectly prepared to produce quite small numbers of items for patterns which perhaps hadn't been produced for very many years, and so there was no great problem, and this was because of the flexibility of the use of copper plate, engravings and transfer printing, and of course hand decorating. This was in the higher quality which did start to impose these same restrictions. One other thing, of course, was the direction in which design was changed, because it coincided with the period known as Art Deco. The pattern books showed that Copeland's were absolutely in the vanguard of Art Deco. The trouble with it was that we were expected to produce traditional designs, traditional shapes, traditional patterns. And although there was an enormous wealth of new ideas, particularly in applied decoration, on the Copeland factory, very little of it ever got well distributed in the market, because apart from a few advanced thinking retailers like Keele's in particular in London, very few retailers were prepared to take the risk of expensive earthenware and dinnerware and china from Spode, where most people, when they came in and said, well, that's very nice, but I don't think I'll buy one of their traditional patterns. It was still the years when daughter followed mother, son followed father, and there was this endearment by the work people to the proprietors. Sometimes the proprietors were better than others. Nevertheless, they were family, and it was a family business.
Look down into the valley, embrace the whole smoke-girt amphitheatre at a glance, and it may be that you will suddenly comprehend the secret and superb significance of the vast doing which goes forward below. Thus did Arnold Bennett write the Potteries, where in the centre of industrial England is a Turia, famous as the home of Wedgwood pottery. Josiah Wedgwood founded the firm here in 1759, and it is still carried on today by his direct descendants of the 5th and 6th generations. The 18th century factory fund is a reminder of the original Josiah's pioneer work. He even brought the canal here. There were no railways in those days. Of course, much modernization has taken place, but even today the most up-to-date plant outshowers of the original old buildings. This is the old mill, where Cornish stone and sea-washed flints, two of the raw materials for fine china and earthenware, are being ground with water into a fine cream between hard stone blocks. Clays from Dorset and Cornwall are shoveled into tanks, where they are mixed with water by revolving knives. These tanks are called plungers. After this, the liquid stone and clay are thoroughly mixed, passed through a fine sieve and dried under pressure.
Well, in several ways the industry changed and adapted to the conditions of the day. Some manufacturers, let's say at the cheaper end of the market, look towards novelty in terms of their products. Many of the long-established traditional concerns, and I think again with Keele, Delta and Wedgwood, despite the very difficult circumstances of the day, they actually, for example, brought in freelance designers. And Wedgwood, during the course of, say, 1929 to 1935, brought in quite a number of people who were well known in the fields. Keith Murray, the architect, actually designed pottery for the Wedgwood firm. Eric Revilius, John Skeeping, the sculptor, was producing work for Wedgwoods before the 1930s, over to 1928.
Now it's beginning to take shape. Ultimately, it will be a vase designed by Keith Murray in a new Wedgwood clay body called Copper Basalt. A group of modern Wedgwoods by the English artists John Skeeping and Keith Murray.
I think many people consider that, I suppose quite rightly, that the traditional process of applying a tissue transfer from an engraved copper plate, that this was an indication of quality. Because quite obviously the copper plate itself was hand engraved. Many manufacturers retained copper plates printing for that reason alone.
The colour is rubbed into the engraving on a hot copper plate and the surplus colour removed. Finally, the plate is polished with a corduroy pen. And here is being printed a 16-inch pattern for California University. First, the print is made on specially prepared tissue paper. Then the assistant cuts it out. highly skilled worker, the transferrer fits it carefully onto the pepper. A third rubs it on hard to get the colour well into the surface of the ware. Now the table is washed off and the printed paper is ready for glazing and filing.
There was a suggestion, which was a fairly short-lived one, that maybe the ceramic products of the day were too traditional, although elaborately decorated. And certain people, notably Gordon Forsyth, came up with the idea that maybe the British pottery industry should attempt to produce products that were more in keeping with continental taste. The House, of course, came into Forsyth's reckoning. And this seemed to be quite a good idea for a short time, and then somebody realised that if this was to become the sort of guiding principle of the ceramic industry, then this could in fact lead to further redundancies, that all the decorating shops in Staffordshire and paintresses would within a very short space of time would become unemployable, simply because of the emphasis on simpler forms. So that was a fairly short-lived idea. Some firms experimented with it to a limited extent, but these were the sort of things that had been floated around at that time. For the Wedgwood firm, it was a very significant period because, of course, their old Wedgwood factory, which had been built, opened in 1769, was by the 1930s a rather old-fashioned place, and they had new ideas about improved methods of firing with the electricity, for example. And they felt that they needed to not only move to new premises in order to introduce these more revolutionary processes, but at the same time, in a sense, to create a new image for the company. They wanted to retain their traditional limbs of the past. They wanted still to be associated with their family, which is our Wedgwood. But at the same time, they didn't want to be seen as a firm standing still. They wanted to be making further progress. And so we find that, again, during the 1930s, they made steps in the direction of building a new factory. And of course, as a result of that, by the end of the decade, the Boston firm was constructed and open for use.
Born in Toscana in 1899, Clarice Cliff is one of the most famous ceramic artists of the past century. She started work as a gilder and paintress in the pottery industry when she was 13 and studied art and sculpture at Bursum Art School in the evenings. After apprenticeships at Wilkinson's Pot Bank, she launched her own studio in 1927 at the Newport Pottery and the famous Bizarre Ware in 1928. These deco shapes with freehand on-glaze enamel colours were immediately popular and were produced through the 30s. 70 paintresses and 4 boys hand-painted the ware under her direction, and she was credited with the often angular and geometric shapes as well as the bright and bold designs. Her imaginative marketing displays and the use of celebrities in sales promotions spread her fame worldwide. She invented the notion of the career woman, and there were constant stories about her in the press. The coming of World War II saw the end of decorated ware in Britain for over a decade, and Clarice and new husband Collie Shorter devoted their time to their house Chetwynd in Clayton. But the crazy, bizarre decade of the 30s secures Clarice Cliff as perhaps the most iconic and outstanding ceramic designer of the century.
Art Deco styling probably took the world by storm for a few years, but in fact there was a much more sophisticated, more elegant style which captured the interest of architects and designers, which is called the International Modern Style, the long, sleek, sophisticated, smooth outline. Think of the trains tonight of Bresley, for example. And that style was well developed by designers like Susie Cooper, and also at the Wedgwood factory by Tom Wedgwood and John Goodwin in their tableware design, Annular, and then taken up in decorative wares by the architect Keith Murray, who worked for Wedgwood during the period 1933 to 39.
Well, the most vivid thing I can remember was the day war broke out. The fun of us were mines, mostly. There was 2 already in the army because it was reservist. We had an old radio with a walnut case and a silk fret, and we were waiting for the ominous announcement that Mr. Chamberlain gave at 11 a.m. And always remember the sentiment coming out later on in the day when war was declared, and the cry of Sentinel Special, Sentinel Special.
Once the war broke out, and it was quite clear that this was a real war, the industry was contracted. That meant that quite a lot of factories were closed, and their work was transferred to other factories which were allowed to remain open. This, of course, released both men and women from war work, either in active service or in munitions. And immediately, regulations came into force, indicating which types of wear could be made and what they were to look like.
Yet another method is casting. That's the time-honored way of sending liquid into a shape used for anything from railway wheels or prolongers. In this case, it's a cover dish. And when it comes out of the mold after having set it's all complete, even to the handle. Cups, saucers, plates, molds, mugs, dishes, a whole range of pottery is ready for the fire. In the case of plates, they're placed between layers of sand to keep each one true in shape. This is another stage at which science has been called to the aid of art. The electrically fired salamander saves time, and the temperature can be kept in perfect control. The temperature in the oven is approximately 1145 degrees centigrade. Imagine the heat the cook must get in the oven at home when she brings out the plate all covered with little brown veins like a leaf in autumn. The real answer is the cook has no control. This is the control panel. The apple shape is kept on the heat in every section of the oven. What a contrast this is to the sooty bottle oven which for so long has been a characteristic shape under the hot plate. Let's get back quick to the shiny bottom one. The opposite end, where they all come out telling each other they've been through hell. How do they get that shine on their faces? It's the glazing process. A simple dip to the glaze and then being set up to dry. You can tell by the professional twist of the wrist that the man who's doing it is an expert, even if you couldn't see by his cap that he's in the first level. Glaze can also be applied by aircraft, blowing on a shiny surface, and then they're all ready for the second fire, placed so that only a tiny point is touching them. Modern pottery, like most of the best of modern things, has a keynote of simplicity. Plain colours and pastel shades are always pleasing and somehow soothing, but there's still a demand for attractive patterns. The decorations are added by transfers. Dye is rubbed into engraving and printed on thin, moist paper. Mind you don't tear it. An alternative method is roller printing from an engraved cylinder. It's much faster and comes out on mass production lines. Isn't it marvelous the way he handles it without tearing it? This is the way some people make the best of the Sunday newspaper.
Principally, decoration was forbidden for the home market. The only concession in the early years of the war was that there could be a band about 1/8 wide at the top of the piece. There could be coloured bodies or coloured glazes, along with white or ivory wear. By 1942, it was clear that this was not a satisfactory state of affairs, and the new utility regulations came into force in June 1942, which meant the end of anything coloured. There would be no more lines or coloured glazes or coloured bodies. The end result was that for years then, the British people were only allowed to have white or ivory coloured pots, and naturally enough that got very boring by the time the regulations were changed. The wares in this case all fall within the group utility wear. They all happen to be decorated with the ivory coloured glaze which was allowed. The interesting thing is that manufacturers didn't have the manpower or the capacity to produce any new shapes for utility wear. So what we're looking at are shapes from many years earlier than 1942, left without decoration. And these are the wares which the home market was only allowed to have for the whole of the war period, right through until August 1952. I suppose the big difference for the Second World War was the use of aircraft, and so the invention of the Anderson shelter. And we have here from Shorter Brothers fantastic night lights in the form of an Anderson shelter, and on the top carved out ARP, air raid precautions. A wonderful piece was being found, given to us by a collector. Very glad to have it. The instructions as far as the utility wear was concerned were for priority to be given to government orders, and the recipients of government orders were places like hospitals, schools, the services, and the British restaurants, which I suppose were a major feature of the war. There was always a shortage of wares for the home market, even though it was limited just to the ivory or white wares. One of the big problems was there was insufficient cups, and people were ending up having to drink from jam jars. And so the Board of Trade issued a directive which said, we must have cups, you must make a priority of making cups. And if your problem is that you can't make sufficient handles, then put out onto the market handleless cups. And so a vast number of cups, which were really like beakers, came out onto the market. And the answer given by the Board of Trade was these could be either used for cooler beverages, or they could become sugar pots or honey pots. And so the problem at that time of not enough cups was solved by the handleless cup. Towards the end of the war, a certain amount of ware was allowed to be made which was described as fancies. During the war, things like tobacco jars, vases, bowls were not allowed. But a small number of companies were given permission to restart for the home market certain fancies. And that, I suppose, led to the frustration, which I think, reading the journals of the day, seemed to dominate the period following the war until the utility regulations were changed. And that frustration was the fact that, first of all, there were not sufficient workers, and some of the factories which were closed at the beginning of the war never reopened. It's just one of those awful things which happened. Having got some workers back, there then started to be the problem of not sufficient materials, particularly coal for firing the bottom ovens. And there were lots of reports of discussions in Parliament on how on earth could the pottery industry be expected to fulfil the demand of the home market when it hadn't got the coal to fire away. And regulations were changed to increase the amount of fuel available for this district. Shortage of clay meant again that there was very little that could be produced. And one of the other big things was that all decorated ware had to go for export in order to earn money to finance the war. And to frustrate the problems of producing for the export market, they didn't have enough transfers to make the decorated ware, so in the end it became a vicious circle. The Board of Trade realised how important it was to get industry back into a good frame of mind. And so in 1946 they produced the exhibition Britain Can Make It. This was in conjunction with the Council of Industrial Design. And what it was an exhibition of selected wares, so that the best of English design and manufacture could be shown to the world to say, look, we can do it, come and buy it, and there it is for you. But needless to say, it got a nickname because Britain can make it, but Britain can't have it, because we couldn't still have the decorated ware for the home market. That was an important exhibition. It showed the industry what was possible. And the designers were chosen for that exhibition were the famous and very good designers of the pre-war period, people like Susan Cooper, Victor Scanlon, Sam Talbot, Eric Slater. These really important people who've been with the industry for many years, and clearly now ready to produce something different. The Britain Can Make It exhibition helped a great deal to focus their mind on design, but the other angle that they began to concentrate on was how to improve the factories and therefore the production methods. And quite a lot of manufacturers started to demolish bottle ovens and replace them with new factories incorporating tunnel ovens. And many tunnel ovens were installed in the period 1946 right through the 50s. This, of course, well in advance of any Clean Air Act, which in the end sounded the death knell of the bottle oven. Manufacturers produced new canteens for their workers, new places to hang their coats, that sort of thing. And Barrett's of Burslem are noted as having produced a new decorating shop which was air conditioned with dustless floors. And this is as early as 1948. So we have this great investment in the industry, in new machinery and in new methods. Johnson Matthey were important at this time in producing a new means of transfer printing decoration onto the surfaces of pots. It was going to speed up the industry and produce much more of this very important export work for the foreign earnings. So the people became optimistic. They were looking to the future, although the frustration of still making right work for the home market sometimes overcame them. Most industries needed, particularly the pottery industry, which was still in the straitjacket of the utility regulations, the home market being only allowed to have undecorated white wares. And it was Roy Midwinter in the spring of 1953 who showed us the way forward for design in the 1950s. His new range of stylecraft pottery in 1953, just about at the same time as the coronation. And this gave the pottery industry and Britain the opportunity to see what is new. And what was new were entirely new shapes, based mainly on ideas from America. The new shapes were four-sided rather than round. And the first launch was of a very narrow rim plate rather than the wide border rims that we were so much used to. And one of the reasons for this was that America doesn't have condiments on the edge of the plate. Instead, the condiments are scattered all over. The other thing America do is use the fork in the right hand, and so you need a rather deep plate in order to help you shovel the food onto the fork. And so Stylecraft is launched with the American market in mind. It's also launched with the home market in mind because in the first range, we have 36 new patterns from the young designer Jessie Tate, and this is a real revelation as far as the pottery industry is concerned. Really lively, colourful designs, primary colours being one of the dominating features of the 1950s. Another thing that starts to happen as the 50s progress is that design has new ideas which never before have appeared as surface pattern on pots. For example, we start to have furniture, cutlery, plants in terracotta pots, all things that may have been seen first at the Festival of Britain, but are now coming through as surface patterns, unknown previously, giving designers an enormous amount of freedom. One of the patterns that has supposedly become an icon is called Homemaker, and this was designed for Ridgeway pottery by Enid Seeney. And this links very well with the new technology which is starting to appear in the 1950s. It was in 1955 that the Spoke Company, in collaboration with the British Ceramic Research Association, produced a new type of printing machine called the Murray Curvex. This was using a gelatine dome to transfer one colour printing onto biscuit ware, and Homemaker was designed specifically with that particular printing method in mind.
The Murray curvex was introduced in the 1950s, and it altered the production procedure. The fact that from transfer printing, it was much quicker and more direct. The Murray curvex machine had the copper plate at one end, and it was printed via a gelatine mould which came down onto the engraving, picked the ink up, and then transferred it directly onto the earthenware whiskey plate. And this obviously could be moved at a rather quick rate, much quicker than transfer printing. But there were small drawbacks to the fact that it obviously scraped along automatically, and where there were large areas of colour, it would scrape the colour out, and therefore the engravings had to be fairly deep in places. But even that didn't get over the fact of areas such as on the homemade pattern, which originally were rather large and black. Therefore we had to create white areas in those black areas.
I hadn't got many qualifications except that I liked art, and I wanted to draw. Anything to do with drawing and using my hands. So we lived in Northumberland then, and we got in touch with Mailings, which was a totally unsuitable place for me to go. When we found that out, I thought, well, I'll go to the Potteries. Got my own. I was 18 then, and that's what I did. And I enrolled at the college there, Burslem.
If you feel that industry is a tremendous limitation to your creative ability, then it seems to me that you don't understand the immense possibilities of some of these new techniques that we've developed in the district.
Don't you think a lot of designers in the industry are bound hand and foot by tradition?
Let's get this one straight. First of all, the factory has to live. It has to produce goods to sell. And this question of tradition very often is forced upon the factory by existing markets. But if you mean, as I think you mean, that are we doing all that we designers could do to produce new and interesting things along with the tradition? In other words, a new understanding of tradition, I think that I would probably agree with you that we don't. But it's largely up to you people. It's largely up to people going into the industry to go in with tremendous knowledge, I suppose, of the basic nature of the job, as I've been saying. But you must have imagination, and you must have tremendous sort of punch.
And I was there all the time, night class and day release. And I should have done some exams there, but I wanted to get into a factory. So I joined Copeland's, had 3.5 years there, which was wonderful, wonderful training, wonderful people there. I worked in the design studio with Harold Holdway, Roy Trigg, and a Latvian gentleman. We used to call him Mr. Mickey. Mikulovsky, his name was. And well, they taught me how to draw a little bit better than I could, which was atrocious. I don't know how I had the nerve to go there, but I learnt an awful lot. I learnt how to paint and draw, use raised paste, gild, paint, went into the painting room next door. And of course I had the whole factory to learn from. They'd send me around with a piece of paper to get one piece of ware completely decorated and gilded, and have a good laugh when I got back, because everyone were pre-warned that I was going around to their different departments. And it ended up this piece of pottery with roses, tar roses painted.
1957 saw another new technology brought into our industry. This was the slide-on litho, or the water slide, as some companies prefer to call it. This type of decoration had been known in the glass industry from about 1947, and it was perfected by Johnson Matthey of Burslem by 1957 for use on pottery. The idea here is that the multicoloured photographic image was covered with a plastic film. The plastic film with the colour design was glued onto backing paper, and the slide is actually taking the coloured image with its plastic coat from the paper and sliding it then onto the glazed surface of the pot. The skill for the worker was to remove all the wrinkles and the water and leave a perfect image on the glazed surface. When it was fired, the plastic cover coat disappeared, and from the late 1950s right through until today, we have this type of decoration within the industry. Of course, it meant the end of the hand decoration that we were so familiar with in the 1930s, but it brought perfect, complete images which were reproduced identically on every occasion. Well, I suppose the 60s starts in the late 1950s as far as the design of ceramics is concerned. We have a flavour from two makers of the style which absolutely dominated the 1960s, which is the geometric style, both in shape and surface pattern. Potters used every type of geometry that they could to bring new shapes and new patterns before the public. And what we see from the potters are the use of cylinders, cones inverted one on top of the other, cylinders put on top of spheres to give variety to the shape of the pots. And I suppose the coffee pot is the most extravagant of all of the designs at that time. And the most extravagant of them all is Susan Williams Ellis's pattern totem, where she uses about a 3-inch diameter base with a 13-inch high pot. Quite a hazard on the table. Towards the middle of the 1960s, the extreme geometry softened when we start to get designs like Tempo from Joe Ledger at Royal Dalton, where we have a cylinder sitting on top of a sphere. And so we read even in the trade journals that there's a softening of the geometry. The surface patterns, whether they're produced in the clay or whether they're produced by printing, are also very geometric indeed. The other major feature of the 1960s is the development of oven-to-tableware. In the 1950s again, there was the beginnings of oven-to-tableware from quite a number of manufacturers, none of which were Stoke-on-Trent, which is interesting. By the mid-1960s, most manufacturers were beginning to make this new product, this high-quality body, which could withstand the heat of the oven and then be very presentable to go onto the table. The industry at this time has a funny little turn, because it starts to want to look as if it's studio pottery. Now, in the 1930s, this idea had been rejected out of hand. All those years of glaze technology to get rid of iron speckles is made redundant by the fact that iron is the principal colour that people use in their glazes. I suppose one of the things about the 60s that most of us who live through it remember is the whole business of hippies and flower power. And that was another flavour which influenced the pottery industry. And we have from quite a lot of makers patterns which are dominant in simplistic flower patterns. From Susie Cooper, we have a pattern called Carnaby Daisy, created after she visited Carnaby Street in London. And from Washington Pottery, not a famous pottery for high style, we even have a design called Flower Power. The industry was also influenced by optical art, or op art, where two clashing colours would perhaps affect the eyes. And this is interpreted in two ways. Some manufacturers used the black and white theme and produced services completely of white and black surfaces. And Wedgwood in particular called on one of the great artists of the late 1960s, Eduardo Palazzi, and for them he produced a series of 6 special plates called Variations on a Geometric Theme. These are all circles, squares, or long zigzags, merged into different colours, which just shows that the industry is alert to everything that's going on and produce the designs that they know that people want. I suppose another feature which we think of as quite normal today was the beginnings of coordination, and both CWS potters and Midwinter had cutlery made for them in Sheffield to match the tableware that they were producing. And people like Midwinter and Susie Cooper produced linen to be coordinated with their tableware. We don't even think about it now, but at that time it was a revolution. I suppose one of the major cultural changes for the pottery industry during the 1960s was the predominance of mergers, takeovers, buyouts. There had been some in earlier decades, particularly with people like Lawley's and Alfred Clough. But in the 60s, a whole bandwagon seems to start to roll, and we end up with large conglomerates, particularly dominated by the Wedgwood Group and the Royal Dalton Group. Those two companies own between them probably 50 trade names, and most of those names have now disappeared. And that's one of the big disappointments, I suppose, of what happened to these mergers, that the good old faithful names have now gone. Names like Shelley, no longer available to the industry because they became part of these large conglomerates. From the early 1960s onwards, one of the other major changes was the introduction of a fashion item, the mug. Easily obtained, very often given away with petrol equipment. Companies like Staffordshire Pottery were making $750,000 a week. Goodness knows where they all went. And the end result was that, again, teapots would become less useful because people didn't mind making a cup of tea directly into the mug. And so we have big changes in lifestyle as far as drinking is concerned. But a bigger change is probably the impact of the microwave oven. I've just spoken about the use of oven to tableware, in which items were made in the dish, put into the freezer, brought out of the freezer and put into the oven, and then put onto the table for service. Finally, could then go into the dishwasher. Oven to tableware, a marvellous invention, something that the pottery industry is very proud of, quite rightly. However, the microwave oven means that most of those processes are not needed, because in conjunction with the microwave we have ready meals, which have taken off in a very big way. So now manufacturers are looking at ways of producing dishes in which meals can be cooked directly in the microwave oven. In other words, dishes which contain no metal within their designs. This again reflects casual dining, as it's been called. Very often now families don't sit down together at the table to eat a formal meal. People work very unusual shift patterns. A lot of students now are obliged to live at home, and people come and go in the house at all sorts of odd times, and therefore people don't eat, they graze. And the result of grazing is that food is cooked at all sorts of erratic hours directly onto the dishes in the microwave oven. Again, the industry has had to respond and has done it extremely well. Cooks, chefs, important people who really do have an influence on the industry, especially the hotel wedding companies, are these days much preferring completely white dinnerware. And there was a phase when white and black was very, very popular. And this was particularly seen when Wedgwood introduced white room china with black basalt accompaniments, the ideal for a firm which specialises in black basalt. A millennium design from Port Merion, when many people used lilac and silver in their design themes. This is on a new shape by Susan Williams Ellis called Mandarin shape, and the surface pattern is by Joe Gorman, an in-house designer at the Portmeirion factory. Note also the mix and match elements, different designs and different colourways, all within one overall pattern. The first recession in the pottery industry was in 1979, and a lot of small companies were really hit by that. But it's only since the beginning of the new millennium that we've seen major impact. And really those date from 2001. And we can be specific in when those real tragedies hit the industry. February 2001, foot and mouth disease, and the whole of the countryside was closed. And unfortunately that meant that tourism stopped, and tourists are big buyers of commemorative and catch-penny wares from our industry. That was bad enough, but the bombing of the Twin Towers on the 11th of September 2001 was the real downfall of our industry. American tourists stopped coming to Britain. American people in general had other things to think about, and the importance of a new dinnerware service, also new vases, took very, very much a second place, because now their country, which had not been invaded ever before, was suddenly the target for an unknown and terrifying prospect. And so the pottery industry, who for generations has exported 60% or more of its ware to America, suddenly finds a market shrinking and shrinking. And this has been an enormous problem for the pottery industry. Add to that the fact that fuel costs have risen something over 60% in one 12-month period, and you start to see that things are not very easy for manufacturers in the potteries. Very sadly, competition from the Far East has galvanised itself, got very organised and taken off. And in a way, we've done this to ourselves because we've exported our knowledge. We've exported our machines, we've sent people to the Far East to train the workers over there. And on top of all that, we've ended up building factories in the Far East and brought in product from the Far East whose costs are so much lower than the costs in England. So have we shot ourselves in the foot? Because unfortunately now we're in the position where the potteries no longer probably qualifies for the name the Potteries. This is not any longer the world centre of ceramic production, and this is really bad. For the first time in 250 years, we may not really be able to say this is the Potteries. We've had perhaps the biggest change of all in that there is now no longer two huge conglomerates. We now have Wedgwood and Royal Dalton owned by the same company. It does not seem possible. No one would have dreamt that 200 years ago. And it's very, very different indeed in this area. In fact, large companies are too large now. They can't stop and turn around and respond perhaps as quickly as they would like to. Small companies, which have a niche place in the market, respond very quickly to what the market is wanting. And if you are a small business with, say, no more than 20 employees, you are likely to be much more successful in the current climate than much bigger firms.
Moorcroft, Burgess and Lee, Moore and Pottery, and lots of others in Stoke.
What we've got in here is a history of everything we've ever made here. So you go back to when we first started, which was the Staffordshire dogs, which really got that. I just finished my MA and thought, there's no way I'm ever in this world going to make Staffordshire dog. And within a few months I was making Staffordshire dogs, because you've got to make a living. And the key to it is the fact that we're so proactive in development. We're always developing new products and we're always looking at the marketplace. You know, you've got wages to pay, you've got people that you employ, you're responsible for, and you've got to pay the wages. You know, so you do things that you necessarily wouldn't want to do. But often, I mean, if you look at, you know, a lot of companies, they all started off doing something, just so you've got to keep the business turning over, keep the money coming in. You know, so it is difficult. You can't be too arrogant and too big-headed, otherwise you go bump. You know. I mean, our bread and butter really is everyday mugs and jugs and teapots and things like that. And again, we've been down every single alleyway you can go down. We've beaten every unbeaten path. And we've tried to do absolutely everything to make us a success, you know. And often, there's a reason those paths are unbeaten, is because there's no point, you know. So we've tried everything, we've tried every technique, process, you name it, we've done it, you know. And we can do it, but in doing that, we've become incredibly good at developing products, which is really our forte. But the most important thing to us is the everyday, simple, domestic wear. And that's where all the sales come from. It's day-to-day, bread and butter stuff. And you can't take your eye off that. Once you take your eye off that and go off on these really long tangents, you're in trouble. You've got to have a very good foundation.
We had quite a number of people who are very well known in areas other than ceramic design coming into the pottery industry to design tableware for many of the manufacturers, so that people like Jasper Conran and Paul Costello, well known for their clothes designs, are now designing for Wedgwood, for example. We've got someone like Jeff Banks and Linda Barker designing for Churchill Group. They are well known in household design. It's quite a different way of looking at how things could be done. And then to top all that, we have well-known chefs giving their name to brands, Gordon Ramsay for Royal Dalton, Jamie Oliver for Royal Worcester. These are big changes which we haven't seen before. Perhaps this is the way forward, perhaps this will do something to help rebuild our very famous industry. Let us hope so.
In a nutshell, the future for Stoke-on-Trent lies very heavily in its past, its heritage, its art. Nowhere in the world is an industry so well represented than in Stoke-on-Trent. Everybody has heard of the Staffordshire Potteries. We need to take that forward, we need to bring it into the present and learn from that legacy, and then we need to look into the future with the same optimism as the people who invented it in the first place. If we can do that, that is our salvation.
Out of original Victorian buildings, the clay is moulded, shaped and decorated to produce works of art. Cups and saucers, plates and teapots rush like magic out of the clay. May the ovens never grow cold. May Stoke-on-Trent, the pottery town, still continue to be the heart of British craftsmanship.
Thank you, Ray. That's the third time I've watched that, and there's new material in it every time I watch it. But I wonder if you've got time to answer a few questions for us. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it wasn't exhaustive, it wasn't all-inclusive, but that's an hour, that's a full hour, and designed to be just an hour presentation. I don't know if anyone has any questions that I can help with.
Yes, I got one.
Yes.
As somebody who's worked in both China and tile factories, tile manufacturing is not mentioned in any of your films.
There are many films I have of tile making, yes, many. Richards and Johnson's and whatever. There's a whole, if you want to have a look at my website, the Film Archive, you'll find a whole hour-long documentary just on tile making. It's called A Night on the Tiles. So all the archive of tile making, and it was a tile maker from Richards Tiles that was instrumental in saving the Gladstone works from being demolished, and so the tile makers and Johnson's very supportive and very important in giving us the Gladstone Museum. So just because I haven't shown it today does not mean to say there's a wealth of footage on tile making, and if you would like to have a look at it, you can leave your email. I'll send you a file to download to have a look at tile making, which goes back to the history of tiles through the centuries as well. So it goes right up to the most modern factory of Johnson's Tiles, which is still working in Tunstall. So we go right up to tile making today. So there we are. And so I haven't done sanitary ware either today, because we've got some wonderful film footage from the 20s of Twyfords in action, with personal reminiscence and saying why they were important in the industry for helping other kinds of ceramic manufacture. And it's nice on some film shows. In that particular one, they're stacking basins, and I've had a film show where I've had someone shout out, "That's my dad!" As a young man. And there's someone here that was involved in sanitary ware. We've got people with us today involved in sanitary ware. So I've had to make decisions on today to keep it to an hour. So the tiles weren't in, and the sanitary ware isn't in. There's a couple of examples. So just because you haven't seen it today does not mean it doesn't exist. If you look on, just Google Film Archive, one word, you'll find the website and you see all the material that's available, because there are over 100 titles on that website that you can actually access and own. And A Night on the Tiles is just one of them. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Ray, it's a great film, and I'm hoping as many people as possible will see it in the future. I just wondered, in terms of reaching the modern young audience, whether you thought of converting, I haven't seen your website, some of the format to the 9:16 short video format?
Yes, of course. And most of the productions I put out, you see, this isn't a film. I've done this purely for today. It's put together from different sections for today. So this is not available, but it has elements of many other films. The point is that the 9:16 format is modern, and you decide, I opened it in 16:9, 16 across, 9 down. I opened it in that because I showed some modern film of today. Then I went into some old film and kept that format over the titles until we saw Kathy speaking. The problem is, this is an archive presentation for you who are interested in ceramics and the industry. To make that work in the 69 format, I have to crop. I have to go to the side and crop the top and bottom. I actually don't. I move the picture up and down to get the most effective part of the picture. But for archive purposes, I want you to see the whole picture, which is called Academy format, 4:3. It comes from the art world, where the 4:3 rectangle is like one of those perfect shapes. It's called Academy ratio. That was, television took it from the cinema. The cinema took it from the world of art. Until we have this new letterbox sort of format. But I don't want to compromise the valuable archive visual information in those pictures which were framed by excellent camera people to get within one frame a range of activities, because you can read the frames of a film. I ask people to don't just look at the thing in the middle, look around, see what else you can spot in terms of location and surrounding material, visual information in the picture. I want you to see the full frame because it's archive, and we've got a specialist meeting today of archive and historical thing. So there's deliberately today I've kept the original films in their academy format so that you can see that. Yes, I can do that. I can expand and make it fill the frame. And then when I go through, I actually, even in the opening titles, where you saw me drift across, I've used it several times because I said about repeating, because they're from different parts. The one where there are lots of smoking ovens and we're panning across, and we go from a marl hole to those ovens. In that opening title, I made the picture move from when the picture starts, it's on a marl hole, which is the bottom of the picture. As it goes across, you get the ovens stretching upwards. And you don't know that I've made the picture move upwards to follow the better composition in the same shot. So I've made the picture, actually, you drift up the picture, you don't know because it's moving sideways. So I try and do these invisible things, so you're not conscious of them, but I am, if I do things in that format, I'm consciously focusing and positioning, and it's only going up and down because I've got the width to give the most effective part of the picture that shows the most information relevant to the commentary or what we're looking at. So I am very conscious of that, and I'm deliberately making decisions about it. Okay, thank you. Yes?
Interesting, you mentioned about in the earlier part of the last century that the state bought, or ESA bought an awful lot of our produce, our pottery. But equally, at the beginning of the last century, many of our very talented painters went out to a place called Trenton, which is in the USA, where there was a sort of almost an equivalent of our Potteries industry.
Yes, yes.
Which my husband's, one of his relations were called Sherrittware, and they actually went out, they're very talented painters, and set up quite a large industry out there, an art and crafts industry.
Absolutely.
So we did have a lot of connections with the States over there.
Absolutely. It's not part of today's agenda, which is why it's not there. But that, and setting that up, a lot of things happened in connection with the Chartist movement and the Chartist riots and the workers' riots of the 19th century, that people were actually sent abroad, or the Potter's Examiner, which was the voice of the pottery industry. If you had to publish everything anonymously, because if it was found you were writing for this particularly, your name would be called and you'd be blacklisted. You wouldn't be able to find work. But there was this idea that the editor of the Potter's Examiner also set up this scheme for emigrating to America, where they were setting up these bases to make pottery, Pottersville and so on. So there was a whole thing about getting to the fresh air, and emigration was being encouraged. To say all that today in an hour was not, and it would be a distraction for me to include it, but it is known, and I've done presentations on the Chartist movement and the Chartist riots and its effect on the industry on certain anniversaries in the past few years. So there's a programme called the Battle of Burslem, because the culmination was actually confronting the dragoons that were staying at the Leopard Inn in Burslem, and the workers from the Potteries and Leek, the mill workers, confronting, and that is where unfortunately the one death that did occur in the confrontation, which is commemorated, Josiah Heapy, was killed in that, and we commemorated him because it was an anniversary a couple of years ago. So yes, that is all known, and that's the value of the archive to me, because we can take the different narratives, the different focuses, the different stories, and still use archive. Because if we go back into those periods, I'm using archive still illustrations and newspaper material illustrations, that kind of news way of portraying. So the Chartist Riot is a full production, and because the local theatre, the Victoria Theatre, their very first documentary, and they were world famous for their musical documentaries. Their first documentary was 1964, called The Jolly Potters, about the Chartist riots, because the wonderful filmmaker Philip Donovan filmed many sequences from that production, trying to sell the idea to the BBC to make a television programme, which it was not made, and all that film remained unseen until a few years ago when I got funding from via Mace to digitise all the film holdings of the Victoria Theatre archive that we could put on and actually for the first time show these sequences filmed in 1964 and never seen since, matching with the original sound recordings, which never matched with the pictures, and I was stitching everything together, and with the script of that show, which is in the Victoria Theatre archive, and I was with an archive presentation at the Victoria Theatre, New Vic Theatre, yesterday, actually find where all the takes were and reconstruct an impression of that show. That means that I could use those dramatisations, which are actual dramatisations of letters, documents of the time. They are contemporary, and that's what I try to use, contemporary readings. Sometimes I put in my films actual historical characters, but what they are saying is of that character. So I have been known to actually be Josiah Wedgwood, but I only ever do that if the words I am speaking are the words of Josiah Wedgwood, because they're in the museum, and Gay, where she is, has helped me endlessly at the museum, spending a lot of time. Where are you, Gay? There we are. Gay Blake Roberts, the Wedgwood Museum, and they have all the collected correspondence. Fortunately, the other end, the people he wrote to, saved the letters. So you get everything that's Josiah saying. And I use those verbatim words, and that gives you the sense of period. So in the Jolly Potters, you have verbatim words from the 1840s. And that becomes archive when you can mix it with other archive and make a presentation. But all these elements, it's like a great, huge tapestry, and we're looking at one area of the tapestry today. But it does relate, and it does cross-thread with lots of many other things. So again, you can get in touch and find what is there on a certain topic in the archive. It's not the most helpful question to ask me, what do you have in the archive? It's not a helpful, but if you come and say, do you have anything on this particular company in this year, or that character, or that, and I can say, yeah, and I can send you what there is on the topic or focus that you're looking for, and I can respond to that. It's very difficult to just say, in a blanket term, what there is in the archive. I hope that helps. Okay, there's one more. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Maybe we have time during the lunch hour.
Oh,
we all have to be back at 2:00 for the afternoon presentation. I just wanted to say many thanks to Ray for today's presentation. Not only for the time and effort it took to put the film together, but for the opportunity to see old colleagues like Kathy Niblett, Gordon Elliot, to hear people like Robert Copeland and others in the industry. It was just a real it was a real treat, and I can appreciate that it's just a glimpse into one aspect of the industry which you have on file, and I hope you'll be back to tell us more at another occasion. Thank you very much. I do just have one thing I wanted to say. You will have all had your, hopefully NCS members will have had your journal and your flyer about the summer school. I just wanted to say that the flyer suggests that maybe we would be in the old-fashioned accommodation in Asbury and Fisher buildings at Chester, because the Grosvenor accommodation needed some major restructuring. I heard this week, after we'd gone to print and the leaflet had gone out, we'll definitely be in Grosvenor, so we'll definitely be in the upgraded accommodation, and I thought that might make the difference to some of you, whether you would decide to come or not. You've got some...
Just some general housekeeping. It's lunch break now. We're starting again at 2 o'clock promptly. As you will have heard during the presentation, that wasn't an accident of the sound, it was torrential rain outside. So if you're going out for lunch to the cafe either in the SU Square, or if you're NCS and booked in for the lunch at Keele Hall, you'll know that it's a walk away, but you can drive down today. There's not much happening on campus, so you can drive from Chancellor's down to Keele Hall. That would probably be safer. So do that. Do make a donation of £2 please for coffee and biscuits. I know it's inflationary, but that's the way of all life now. If you're not a member of the Northern Ceramic Society and you're here today, we have a regular programme of meetings, and we have events like this. So if you're enjoying it, do think about joining us. You can always join for a year, and then if you don't get your money's worth, you can not join again. But we do have an offer on at the moment, that if you join, I think from this point, where's our membership secretary? Jessica. Is it correct for me to say that if you join from this point onwards, you get next year as well?
Well.
Or do you get all of this year's publications?
If you join today, you'll get all this year's and all last year's publications as well.
Okay, if the deal is if you join today and the membership year runs until the end of September, you get all of this year's and last year's publications. So give us 6 months to prove that we're really good. And then if we're not, don't join up next year. But join us if you can. Okay, we've got lunch now, so if you've booked in for NCS lunch down at Keele Hall, I'll see you down there shortly.
Silhouette, should I say, from windows. not helpful, in fact, I was doing it in front of the morning. I mean, that did not grab me. Where are the tools? Where are the Victorian costumes? Where are the, you know, I mean, I'm sorry, these are just boring. I think this is the second batch. That's the second batch. But the first one's had all these spurious dates. And of course, not knowing that was going to be the entrance, I said, what on earth are those doing there? And if you look, there's sort of a person. It's so old hat. That's been done in places like Brooklyn. It's inherently heritage funded old property at the moment. I mean, it's nothing innovative. The question is whether it's now black on white or white on black. I think it's probably white. I mean, I'm not inspired. I think that's better. Yes.
Well,
that's all I'm
it's clear and simple, I suppose that's the
But you know, positive, yeah. You know, how many people are going to actually know what that's all about? And you know, I mean, fair enough, put a sign there, but how many people are going to want to see that go from the museum or to?
Particularly when, as they're crossing that road, they're hopefully looking to make sure they're not going to know that.
So, so there's a bit of a strop from me. Anyway, I think they're going to relook at that and put, as a fewer people, tools of the trade, you know, even if it's not a barrow or a scythe or a shovel.
You need to imply that the physical working, that there is a dynamism to the working process.
Not just a group of people
standing around.
So if there's an atmosphere on Monday, you'll go, I'm afraid I think I'm responsible for it. But I do think, I'm sure Ray would be lovely.
I mean, I just absolutely, I just love that. Well, I was also taking a little notes to remind you, I'm rubbish at remembering details, and there's having just the odd occasion, oh yeah, that's a film that's really good. Oh, that's a, you know, really nice.
I've known Ray for 34, 38, maybe 40 years. He's played Star Wars twice for me. He played Brinkley for me.
Yeah.
He's a brilliant actor.
I can imagine.
And his partner, I don't think they're married. His wife died very tragically, very young. And he's with Virginia now, this lady in blonde, lady next to him. She's the most wonderful operatic singer. And they used to do, she was Stoke-on-Trent Theatre Group, and she did it at Stoke-on-Trent Operatic Society. So it was marvellous for him. The other thing he did for me, which was absolutely breathtaking, on Armistice Day, he came and read the first World War poems with his Armistice Day film behind. It was so people really floods into tears.
Yeah.
And he reads them so wonderfully. So I think we ought to use him. If we're going to try and get some life into our operation.
That's, to me, that is definitely the thing, is that we need more hands-on, we need more live action, and we between us, we can get hold of people. I know we haven't got a budget, but you know, a lot of people.
Well, it's budget and budget, isn't it?
I mean, a lot of people just can't do expenses.
Yes, I'm sure they would too. You know, I mean, yes, obviously we'd have to pay for it if he makes a film for us, but then it becomes our property.
And the use of that would be, you know, years.
Yeah,
because it doesn't even have a date, does it?
Oh, no, it doesn't. So at least during the picture, so when it comes up at meetings, you'll all want to be able to log in and say, yes,
yes, please, yes, I know him, it's good, it's fantastic, please.
Right, I'll organise that.
Okay.
We'll go and grab some lunch. But I just sort of was there and
thank you.
tip you off as to what I was up to.
Wonderful, thank you very much.